The sound of the zipper closing on that suitcase still echoes in my head sometimes. It's been 8 months now, and I can still see Edward's hands moving so deliberately, folding his shirts like he was packing for a business trip instead of walking out of my life forever. I'm Tessa, and I turned 32 last month. Celebrated alone with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine that cost more than I should have spent. Edward would have remembered. He always remembered everything that mattered to me, even when I forgot to mention it mattered. We met 4 years ago at a mutual friend's housewarming party in their new suburban home. I was going through one of those phases where I thought I wanted something different, something stable. Edward was standing by the kitchen island, nursing a beer and listening politely to someone's story about their recent vacation. He had this way of giving people his complete attention, like whatever they were saying was the most important thing in the world. When our eyes met across that crowded room, he smiled this genuine smile that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in years. He worked as a financial advisor, which sounds boring until you realize how good he was at taking care of people. Not just their money, but their whole lives. He helped his elderly neighbor set up automatic bill payments when she started forgetting. He researched the best schools when his sister was house hunting. He planned our dates weeks in advance, making reservations at restaurants he knew I'd love before I even knew I loved them. Me, I was managing social media for a local fitness chain. Not glamorous, but it kept me busy and let me feel creative. I liked the flexibility, the ability to work from anywhere, the excuse to be on my phone all the time. Edward never understood why I loved the chaos of last-minute campaigns and constantly changing priorities, but he supported it anyway. He even helped me organize my finances when I realized I'd been overspending on apps and subscriptions I'd forgotten about. Kiernan was my college roommate's older brother, 5 years ahead of us, but somehow always around. He was the guy who knew where all the good parties were, who could talk his way out of any situation, who made ordinary Tuesday nights feel like adventures. When we all graduated and scattered, Kiernan was the only one who stayed in touch consistently. Not in an obvious way, just random texts about funny things he'd seen or articles he thought I'd find interesting. While Edward was building his practice and talking about our future together, Kiernan was bouncing between freelance projects, traveling on a whim, living the kind of life I'd convinced myself I didn't want anymore but secretly envied. He worked in digital marketing too, but for companies that let him set his own schedule and work remotely from wherever he felt like being that month. Edward liked Kiernan initially. He thought it was sweet that I had such a long-time friend. He'd ask about him the way you ask about someone's family members, genuine interest without any hint of jealousy. When Kiernan would visit town and join us for dinner, Edward would pick up the check and include him in conversations about sports or current events. I remember thinking how mature it all felt, how adult. The shift happened gradually. Maybe it was the night Kiernan texted me during Edward's birthday dinner, some inside joke about a professor we'd both hated. I laughed out loud and showed Edward, expecting him to find it funny too. Instead, he just nodded and asked if we could put phones away for the rest of the evening. Or maybe it was the weekend I canceled our planned trip to visit Edward's parents because Kiernan was having a crisis with his business partner and needed someone to talk him through it. I drove 2 hours to meet Kiernan at some dive bar where we ended up closing the place down while he processed his feelings about entrepreneurship and commitment. When I got home at 3 a.m, Edward was waiting up. Not angry, just concerned. He made me tea and asked if everything was okay if Kiernan was safe. I felt guilty for the first time, seeing how worried he'd been, how quickly he'd shifted into caretaker mode even when I'd basically abandoned him for another man. But guilt is an uncomfortable feeling, and it was easier to get irritated with Edward for waiting up, for making me feel bad about being a good friend. I started telling him he was being clingy, that I needed space to maintain my other relationships. He backed off immediately, apologizing for making me feel suffocated. The lies started small. White lies about where I was going, who I was with, how long I'd be gone. When Kiernan came to town, I'd tell Edward I was having girls' night or staying late at the office. Kiernan had this studio apartment above a vintage record store, and we'd order pizza and drink wine and talk until morning about everything and nothing. Sometimes we'd watch movies on his laptop, sharing the tiny couch, and sometimes those nights ended with us falling asleep tangled together in a way that felt both inevitable and wrong. I told myself it wasn't cheating because we never officially talked about what it was. Kiernan was good at keeping things ambiguous, at making me feel like I was reading too much into stolen moments and lingering touches. He'd pull back just when things felt too real, reminding me he wasn't ready for anything serious, that he valued our friendship too much to complicate it. Edward started asking different questions. Instead of "How was your night?" he'd ask, "What time did you leave the office?" Or "Did you drive straight home from dinner?" I'd get defensive, asking why he needed to track my movements, whether he trusted me or not. He'd always apologize and say of course he trusted me, but I could see the doubt creeping in around the edges of his expressions. I started keeping my phone face down during meals. I'd excuse myself to respond to texts, claiming work emergencies that required immediate attention. Edward would nod and tell me to take my time, but I caught him watching me sometimes with this look I couldn't quite interpret. Not suspicion exactly, more like he was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. The financial stuff made it worse. Edward had always been generous, paying for most of our dates, covering utilities when I was between campaigns, never making me feel bad about the income difference between us. But I started taking advantage of that generosity in ways that made my stomach twist with shame. When Kiernan suggested weekend trips to nearby cities, I'd tell Edward they were work conferences and let him pay for my travel expenses. When Kiernan and I would go out for expensive dinners, I'd use the credit card Edward and I shared for emergencies. I justified it by telling myself that Edward benefited from my friendship with Kiernan too. Kiernan had connections in the marketing world that sometimes led to referrals for Edward's practice. It wasn't entirely untrue, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The night everything imploded, Edward came home early from his monthly poker game with his college friends. I was sprawled on the couch with Kiernan, my feet in his lap, both of us laughing at some ridiculous reality show. We'd been drinking wine, and the boundary between friendly and intimate had dissolved the way it always did when we were alone together. Edward stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the scene. The empty wine bottle, my shoes kicked off, Kiernan's hand resting casually on my ankle. I scrambled to sit up, immediately defensive, asking why he was home so early. He said Jake had gotten sick and the game broke up, then asked if Kiernan wanted to stay for dinner. The civilized way Edward handled it made everything worse somehow. Kiernan declined, claiming he had early meetings, and gathered his jacket with the same practiced ease he used to slip out of complicated situations. After he left, Edward and I sat across from each other at our dining table, the weight of unspoken truths filling the space between us. "We need to talk," Edward said, and something in his tone made my defenses snap into place. I assumed he was going to bring up Kiernan again, complain about our friendship again, make me choose again. I was ready with all my usual arguments about trust and independence and his insecurity issues. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started reading text messages out loud. Messages between Kiernan and me that I thought I'd been careful about deleting. Flirty jokes that crossed lines, plans made behind Edward's back, references to nights that definitely weren't just friendly dinners. My first instinct was to attack the source. I accused him of violating my privacy, of being controlling and paranoid. I told him that going through my messages proved he didn't trust me, and what kind of relationship could survive without trust? I'd used this argument successfully before, watching him crumble under the weight of his own doubt, but this time felt different. Edward just sat there, letting me rant, until I finally ran out of steam. Then he said very quietly, "I need you to block Kiernan, on everything. If you want this to work, that's what has to happen." The word insecure came out of my mouth before I could stop it. Then pathetic. Then a whole stream of accusations about his jealousy and control issues, and his inability to handle the fact that I had a life outside of him. I told him that no self-respecting woman would tolerate being told who she could and couldn't be friends with. Edward listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finally stopped, he stood up and walked to our bedroom. I followed, still arguing, still convinced I could talk my way out of this like I always had before. But he was already pulling clothes out of drawers, laying them carefully in a suitcase I'd never seen before. His movements were methodical, purposeful, like he'd been planning this moment for longer than I wanted to consider. "You're being ridiculous," I said, watching him fold the sweater I'd bought him for Christmas. "You can't just leave because of one argument." He didn't respond, just continued packing. I tried different approaches. I cried, I apologized, I promised to do better. I threatened to hurt myself if he left. Nothing worked. He just kept moving through our shared space, separating his life from mine with devastating efficiency. When he zipped the suitcase closed, the finality of that sound hit me like cold water. This wasn't a dramatic gesture designed to get my attention. This wasn't a negotiating tactic. He was actually leaving. "Where will you go?" I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "I'll figure it out," he said, lifting the suitcase off the bed. "I always do." I followed him to the front door, alternating between anger and desperation. I told him he was throwing away 4 years over nothing. I reminded him of all the good times we'd had, all the plans we'd made. I told him he'd regret this decision for the rest of his life. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and turned back to me one last time. "You're right that I'll regret something for the rest of my life," he said. "But it won't be leaving. It'll be staying as long as I did." The door closed behind him with a soft click, and suddenly the apartment felt enormous and empty in a way I'd never experienced before. Kiernan came over an hour later, bringing wine and acting like we were celebrating something. He seemed genuinely surprised that I wasn't in a party mood, that watching Edward walk away had left me feeling hollow instead of liberated. When I tried to talk about what had happened, about how final Edward had seemed, Kiernan brushed it off. "He'll be back," Kiernan said, scrolling through his phone while I cried on my own couch. "Guys like that always come back." But weeks passed, and Edward didn't come back. His name disappeared from our shared streaming accounts. His mail forwarding kicked in. His favorite coffee mug vanished from the kitchen cabinet where it had lived for years. It was like he was systematically erasing himself from my life, and I realized I had no idea how to stop it because I'd never bothered to understand what I was losing. Kiernan's interest waned as quickly as Edward's presence had disappeared. Without the excitement of secrecy, our dynamic lost its charge. He started canceling plans, taking longer to respond to messages, treating me like just another friend instead of the special someone worth risking everything for. When I confronted him about the change, he looked genuinely confused. "I thought you knew this was just for fun," he said. "I mean, you were with Edward. I figured you understood the situation." The situation. Like I was some side project he'd been tinkering with while I dismantled my entire life. I tried dating other people, but kept comparing everyone to Edward. Not to the excitement of being with Kiernan, which I'd expected, but to the quiet security of being with someone who actually saw me as a priority. The new guys were fine, but none of them remembered that I liked my coffee without milk or noticed when I was stressed about work deadlines. None of them made me feel like coming home was the best part of their day. My friends started treating me differently too, not openly hostile, but cooler somehow. I'd get invited to group events, but not smaller gatherings. Conversations would pause when I joined them, like they'd been discussing something I wasn't supposed to hear. When I finally asked Katie directly what was going on, she was blunt in a way that caught me off guard. "People feel sorry for Edward," she said. "And honestly, Tess, the way you're talking about it makes it sound like you still don't get what you did wrong." I wanted to argue with her, to explain my side of things, but her words stuck with me in uncomfortable ways. I started replaying conversations from that final night, remembering details I'd blocked out in the immediate aftermath. Like how calm Edward had been, how unsurprised he seemed by my reactions. Like he'd been preparing for that conversation for longer than I'd realized. I drove by his new apartment building once, after finding the address through a mutual friend who probably shouldn't have given it to me. His car was in the parking lot next to a small sedan I didn't recognize. Through an open window on what I guessed was the 3rd floor, I could hear laughter. Not Edward's laugh, but someone else's, light and genuine and completely comfortable. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, waiting for I don't know what. Some sign that he was miserable without me, maybe. Some evidence that leaving had been a mistake. But all I heard was the sound of a life continuing without me, and it hurt in ways I wasn't prepared for. The financial reality of my choices hit about 3 months after Edward left. Without his steady income supplementing mine, I had to move to a smaller apartment across town. The new place was fine, but it felt temporary in a way our shared home never had. Edward had been the one who'd made our old place feel permanent, with his books arranged on shelves and his systematic approach to decorating and his way of talking about our furniture instead of my stuff. Kiernan helped me move, but spent most of the day complaining about his back and checking messages from other people. When we finished, he left immediately, claiming he had dinner plans he couldn't cancel. It occurred to me that in all the time I'd known him, I'd never been the dinner plans he couldn't cancel for someone else. I found myself thinking about Edward's sister's wedding the previous summer. I'd been annoyed about spending a whole weekend with his family, but he'd been so excited to introduce me to relatives he rarely saw. During the reception, his grandmother had pulled me aside and told me how happy Edward seemed, how much lighter he'd been since we started dating. At the time, I'd smiled and nodded while mentally planning my escape to the bar where Kiernan was texting me updates about some party he was at. Now I wondered what Edward's grandmother thought when she heard we'd broken up. Whether she'd been surprised, or whether she'd seen something in me that night that I'd been too self-absorbed to recognize in myself. The worst part wasn't losing Edward, though that was devastating enough. The worst part was realizing how little I'd actually known him toward the end. I'd been so focused on managing my double life that I'd stopped paying attention to the man I supposedly loved. I couldn't remember the last time I'd asked about his day without an ulterior motive. I couldn't remember the last time I'd listened to his answer without mentally drafting responses to Kiernan's texts. When Edward's promotion came through a few months before our relationship ended, I'd barely reacted. He'd been working toward it for 2 years, staying late, taking on difficult clients, proving himself worthy of the partnership track. The night he told me, I'd muttered congratulations while typing a response to Kiernan about plans for the following weekend. Edward had opened a bottle of champagne by himself while I finished my urgent conversation. I started therapy after the 4th month of feeling like I was walking through quicksand. Dr. Martinez was kind but direct, asking questions that made me squirm in my chair. She wanted to know about my patterns in relationships, about what I'd been looking for that I wasn't finding with Edward. I gave her all the easy answers about compatibility and growing apart, but she kept pressing. What was it about Kiernan that felt necessary? She asked during one session that left me crying in my car afterward. I wanted to say it was the excitement, the newness, the way he made me feel young and desirable. But sitting in that quiet office, forced to put words to feelings I'd been avoiding, I realized it was simpler than that. Kiernan made me feel special because I had to work for his attention. Edward's love was steady and reliable and available, which somehow made it feel less valuable. Dr. Martinez had this way of letting silence stretch until I filled it with truths I didn't want to face. Like how I'd enjoyed having power over Edward's emotions, how his devotion had made me feel important even as I resented him for it. Like how Kiernan's indifference was a challenge I couldn't resist, even though it left me feeling empty most of the time. You think you sabotaged your relationship with Edward? She asked during our 7th session. I'd wanted to say no, to blame it on incompatibility or bad timing or Edward's inability to trust me. But the word yes came out of my mouth before I could stop it, followed by tears that surprised me with their intensity. I started paying attention to my patterns after that, how I'd create drama when things got too comfortable, how I'd push boundaries just to see what I could get away with, how I'd mistake stability for boredom and chaos for passion. It was ugly work, looking at myself that honestly, but it was necessary in ways I was finally ready to admit. I ran into Edward's best friend Danny at the grocery store 6 months after the breakup. We'd always gotten along well, and I thought maybe he'd give me some insight into how Edward was doing, whether there was any chance of reconciliation. Instead, Danny was polite but distant, like he was talking to a stranger instead of someone who'd been at his wedding. "He's doing really well," Danny said when I asked. "He seems happier than he's been in a long time." the words hit harder than I'd expected. I wanted to ask what that meant, whether Edward had said something about our relationship, whether he missed me at all. But Danny's tone made it clear the conversation was over before it started. I saw them together once, Edward and his new girlfriend, at a restaurant downtown where he used to take me for special occasions. She was pretty in an understated way, the kind of woman who looked comfortable in her own skin. Edward was leaning across the table, completely focused on whatever she was saying, that same attentive expression I remembered from our early dates. What struck me wasn't jealousy, exactly, but recognition. He looked at her the way he used to look at me, before I taught him that his attention wasn't valuable enough to deserve my full presence in return. I wanted to hate her, to find something wrong with her laugh or her hair or the way she gestured when she talked. But watching them together, I could only see what I'd thrown away. Kiernan moved to Denver 3 months ago for a freelance contract that turned into something more permanent. He mentioned it casually over coffee, like it was no big deal, like our years of friendship and whatever else we'd been doing didn't warrant a more significant goodbye. I realized I'd been fooling myself about his investment in me just like I'd fooled myself about so many other things. "We'll stay in touch," he said, but we both knew we wouldn't. He was already mentally in his next city, planning his next adventure, probably texting his next conquest while sitting across from me. I'm learning to live with the quiet now. My new apartment doesn't have the same warmth Edward brought to our shared space, but it's honest in a way our old place stopped being. I can't pretend anymore that I'm the hero of this story, that everyone else overreacted, that I was just unlucky in love. Sometimes I draft texts to Edward. Apologies that try to explain what I was thinking, confessions about how much I miss the life we were building together, questions about whether he ever thinks about what we could have been if I'd been different. But I never send them. He deserves to move forward without me pulling him back into my mess. I'm different now with the people I date. More honest about my limitations, more careful about making promises I'm not ready to keep. It's slower and less dramatic, but it feels more real. I'm learning that excitement isn't the same thing as love, that wanting someone who doesn't want you back isn't the same thing as passion. Dr. Martinez says healing isn't linear, that understanding your patterns doesn't automatically change them. She's right. I still catch myself wanting to create complications when things feel too simple, still feel drawn to people who keep me guessing instead of people who show up consistently. But now, I notice those impulses instead of just acting on them. Last week, I was having dinner with someone new, a guy who texts back promptly and asks genuine questions about my work and remembers details from previous conversations. Halfway through the meal, I felt the familiar itch to check my phone, to create some distance, to prove I had other options. Instead, I put my phone in my purse and focused on the man across from me, really listened to his stories about his family and his job and his hopes for the weekend. It felt revolutionary in the smallest, most ordinary way. I don't know if I'll ever be the kind of person who naturally chooses stability over excitement, who can appreciate devotion without taking it for granted. But I'm trying to become someone who recognizes love when it's offered freely, instead of only valuing it when it has to be earned through games and manipulation. Edward taught me what it looked like to be truly chosen by someone, even though I was too immature to understand the gift while I had it. Kiernan taught me that being wanted isn't the same thing as being valued, that chemistry without commitment is just elaborate loneliness. The lesson I'm still learning is how to want the right things for the right reasons, how to build something real instead of just chasing the feeling of being desired. It's harder work than I expected, less immediately gratifying than the drama I used to crave, but it feels like growing up finally, at 32, in ways I probably should have managed a decade ago. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd blocked Kiernan when Edward asked, if I'd been honest about the boundaries I'd been crossing, if I'd appreciated what I had instead of risking it for what I thought I wanted. But those thoughts lead nowhere useful. Edward made the right choice that night, packing his suitcase and walking away from someone who wasn't ready to love him the way he deserved. The sound of that zipper closing still echoes sometimes, but now it sounds different. Not like an ending I should regret, but like the beginning of Edward's real life, the one where someone appreciates his kindness instead of exploiting it. I hope he's happy. I hope she knows what she has.